resume recording. What I'll do is share our screen and make a start. Does that work for everyone now? Yep. All right. And helps if I bring up my PowerPoint. Let me make it all work. All right. I'll move that over there. Okay, guys, can you see my screen okay? Everything all right? Good. All right. So this lecture is all focused on assessment and how we want to make assessment work when we're talking about very young learners. So what we are going through today is when, why, and what do we actually assess, particularly when we're looking at very young learners. Some of the basic assessment principles from SCASA, looking at assessment of, for, and as learning, looking at the combination of assessment versus evaluation, linking objectives and assessment when we're talking about very young children, looking at the assessments on our school experiences and our expectations of experienced teachers, and then, of course, the assessments for your assignments, and then we'll do a bit of a review of stuff, okay? So when we think about assessment, we have to think about these things. Why do we assess? What are we actually assessing? And when are we assessing? Because each of them is different. So let's look at those from the point of view of children. So when we go through, we've got gorgeous little Eddie and we have Matilda. When we're thinking about assessment, we must keep children in mind. So assessment, if we look at it purely from a point of view of what a school needs you to assess, that's not taking into account the right things. We have to think about children, and we want to make sure that when we're assessing, it's related to how we're going to do things with the children. Because otherwise, why are we assessing? We're not just assessing to find out random things about the kids. We actually want to know what's going on with them so that we can plan the best experiences for them. So I want you to think about when you were on your 2-week prac. What did you see the children being able to do? What couldn't they do? How do you analyze those things to make it work for you in a classroom? Because really what we want to think about is assessment is based around finding out what the kids know, working out what we want to teach, working out what the children need to know, and then working out the best way to blend all of those together. So when we think about assessment, a clear definition of it is, it's the ongoing process, and please note ongoing, process of gathering, analysing, reflecting on evidence to make informed and consistent judgments to improve learning. So it's not about collecting one piece of evidence and going, that's where they are. It's about the ongoing process. And we need to go through the process of actually collecting it, but then we also want to make sure that we are analysing and reflecting, because what we have is a lot of teachers who collect evidence and then that's it. Whereas what we want to be able to do is to actually make sure that it's part of a consistent process that we have. So Marsh in your beginning teaching says it's an activity to obtain information about the knowledge, skills and attitudes of students. Exactly, we want to go through the assessment. So I want you to think about what assessments have you seen teachers create? Now, some of them might be quite complex that you might have seen. Some of them might be quite simplistic, but you will have seen teachers create different assessments and you will have seen them create them and use them in different ways. Now, sometimes teachers of early years, they have lots of formalized assessments and sometimes they're very informal. So you need to work out what is the right balance for you. So we've got to think teachers are creating different assessments, but where does it actually fit in our teaching and learning cycle? So it is a bit like a jigsaw. We want to make sure that we are actually putting things in that become part of our cycle. So if we look at our basics of our cycle, we've got this idea that what do I want my students to learn? So therefore I plan and program it. How am I going to get the students there? That becomes my classroom practice, my things that I'm actually doing. How will I know whether the students have learnt it or not? That is then part of how I assess and record. And where are my students now? That's our reporting process that happens twice a year. Or it could happen a lot more. But within all of that, that center circle says ongoing evaluation, meaning that assessment is about the collection of data. The evaluation is that reflection and analysis part. It's where we want to know what's actually going on and is it working for us. Now, this next one is my favorite cartoon. And this is something that I use all the time. So in there's one kid and he goes, I taught Stripe how to whistle. And he's looking at the dog. And the other kid looks at the dog and says, I don't hear him whistling. And he says, yep, I taught him. I didn't say he learned it. And that's really important, is that sometimes if we concentrate on the input of what we are teaching, whereas if we concentrate on the output of what the children are learning, we actually end up with far more success. A lot of teachers are very focused on, but I taught them, why haven't they remembered it? Well, let's look at why. Let's analyze out what's going on. It could be that you're teaching something they have no interest in whatsoever. It could be completely pedagogically incorrect for them. It could be developmentally inappropriate and they're just not able to process it. It could just be they really don't care about that topic. So you have to think, how do you make sure that you are actually assessing what you have taught? Yes, but more importantly, what they have learnt, rather than just what you have taught. And that's a difference, I think, between our early years versus our middles and upper primary, and particularly our secondaries. We genuinely do want to always start from where the children are. So assessment helps us understand the difference between what we taught and what the children have learned. They're not always the same thing. And that's really, really important for us to remember. They're not always the same thing. Sometimes they learn the weirdest things and we did not intend them to learn those things. So let's look at why we're actually assessing. So why? We use it to monitor the children's development and our learning. We want to assess to be able to guide our classroom planning and our decision making about it. We want to be able to identify the specific needs of individuals, because there's no use planning a whole lot of stuff if it's not actually targeting different children. And finally, we need to report and communicate with others. We have obligations as a school and a class to be able to report to parents twice a year. And we also have obligations as a school to report to the government to say how we are making sure that we fit all the requirements of being a school. So we have to make sure that we report and communicate with others. So what are we actually going to be assessing? We are assessing their child development and their growth. We're looking at the outcomes of our program that we have completed. We're looking at the unique patterns that the children have, their knowledge, their attitudes, their interest. We're doing all of those. And finally, we're looking at our problems or concerns. So just like we want to see the growth, we also want to see where there are some issues. And we need to be able to assess to be able to identify those issues. So when do we assess? So essentially we assess at the start of a program. We do some diagnostic assessment, and that could be as simple as a conversation with some children. Or it could be complex. If I'm working with my 2s and 3s, I might actually go through quite a formalized process of finding out what they know. It could be part of a diagnostic assessment that an entire year level or couple of year levels do in a school. We do a constant assessment along the way of some sort. So we find out, okay, what do they know already? How are they going? What are we doing? That's our formative assessment. So that's keeping check of the different teaching points that we have along our processes. And then we want to make sure that we are doing something at the end to make sure that we understand, okay, we've had this emphasis for this period of time. Have they got it? Nope. All right, let's go back to the beginning again because they've missed this part and they've missed this part, or they just missed the whole lot, or they've done an amazing job. We can take another step forwards. Essentially, we're assessing constantly. but it's the form and the processes that become a little bit different. So we are doing lots and lots of assessment, and this is where oftentimes when you are a beginning teacher, assessment is something that is almost like a mystery to you, and yet it's the thing that we do the most. If you sat and chatted with any early years teacher, they would be able to answer any questions about the children in their classroom quite intimately about their child, because they would know so much about any of the children in their class, as they should. And they'll be able to tell you all about their loves and their dislikes and how they behave and what they do. There's all of this amazing stuff that early years teachers know. So when we're creating our assessments, we have to make sure that we're doing it in a way that actually fulfills our principles that are outlined in our curriculum. So these are our 5 assessment principles, and I've no doubt that you have looked at them in other units. But let's look at it from the point of view of how we want to create something for our early years. So we need to make sure that any assessment that we do is valid. So it means that it has to happen in a real and meaningful context in an early years environment. We don't sit and make our 5-year-olds write great big tests, do we? We make sure that it's actually assessing the outcomes that I need it to assess. We make sure that our assessment is educative. And what that means is that it has to be sound and the children have to learn from it. So again, doing a one-off test, that's not educationally sound. The children aren't learning anything other than they can't fill in the answers. So we have to make sure that they learn from those experiences and that we give them feedback so that they understand what they've done and what they haven't done. We need to make sure that any assessment that we do is fair. Now, it means that that should enable every child to demonstrate the outcomes. So it should be that we allow kids to demonstrate things in different ways so that it is fair. Now, we need to make sure any assessment is explicit. So we don't want to give them kind of quizzes. We don't want to test them. We don't want to do those horrible spot quizzes and let's see what you know. Let's make it explicit. Let's outline so that the children know why you're asking them these questions and what you're doing. And our final thing from SCASA is that we have to make sure that all of it is comprehensive, that we're not just looking at the cognitive domain, but we want to make sure that our assessment has a way of encompassing all of it. So a range of different situations over time, not just one point in time for one domain of some sort. We want to make sure that we have a lot of things. Now, assessment needs to be part of a child's everyday experiences. We want to make sure that it is occurring all the time and that it's not just a tack on that we add on to the end of a unit of work. We want to make sure that it is a link that is vital in our planning process. And authentic assessment is about engaging the kids with the content, with each other, the environment, and so on, rather than just completing some isolated tasks. So we use assessment to find out what the point of, where the gaps are, to find out the point of need, so we teach to that point of need. So when we're thinking about how we create an assessment, we've got our SCASA 5 assessment principles, but then let's look at 5 criteria to make sure that it is actually useful for us. So we need to make sure, again, what is the validity of the assessment? So don't have somebody just give you something that they found off Teachers Pay Teachers. Think about, is it actually valid for the children that you're working with? Is it reliable? So something like our NAP plan, it has a high degree of reliability as a cohort, not for an individual, because it is a one thing at one time. Whereas any of your standardized tests, they're just testing one day in some way. So does it have good reliability? Is it actually manageable? Sometimes with the best of intentions, you're like, right, I'm going to sit and I'm going to interview every single child about what numbers they know, what letters they know, and I'll do that all at the beginning of the year. That's not manageable. It's not something that you can actually do and have it work well for you. All right. Is it trustworthy? So is the assessment credible and built on some good data? Is it transferable in some way? Can the skills be used somewhere else? Has some moderation been taken place? And is it authentic? Is it actually suitable for young children? Because a lot of times I find that we have administrative people who decide that we as early years educators should do these sorts of things. Well, most of the time it doesn't work when you're working with 4 and 5-year-olds, does it? So we have to make sure that we hold ourselves tight and say, yeah, that's not suitable for when we're working with young children. So you've got to think about the usefulness of your assessment that you have. Now, when we're thinking about assessment, you will see this mentioned all the time. Assessment for, of, and as learning. So assessment for learning occurs when the teachers use their ideas about the student progress to inform their teaching. All right, assessment as learning is when you're involving the students and you get them to reflect and monitor their progress, and it informs their future learning goals. So that's your formative assessment. And assessment of learning is more your summative, where you're using it at the end of a process of some sort, where the kids can make some, they're summing up different things that they've done, and we get to make some judgments about their achievement against our goals, our standards, or the objectives that we had for the unit, and so on. So we hear the words assessment and evaluation used often interchangeably. If we look at them slightly differently, it helps you to make a decision about when you do each one. So if you think about assessment as the process of gathering the data, so effective teachers, they gather and record this data in a range of ways. That's where you do your checklists, you do your anecdotal notes, you might do some recordings of the kids, you might collect some audio of their reading and so on. That's your assessment. Each of those is gathering that data. Your evaluation is the process of where you make some judgments about that information. So you then go through and you draw the conclusions about the progress of the students and how it's worked for them. Now, that bit in yellow there, assessment without analysis, is meaningless. So just collecting a whole range of random data does nothing. So you have to make sure, how am I ensuring that I'm assessing? Yes, but then I must go through a process of evaluation. So I can collect some data about a child and I can do some anecdotal notes about, gosh, they're a bit withdrawn at the moment. I can then collect some more data about the child and I can find out that they're not talking to their friends either. I can then collect some more data about the child and I could sit them down and find out that they're having difficulties identifying any of the words that we've been doing. And so then I'm starting to build up a bigger picture that the child is really having some issues. But if I don't do that analysis, it'll just be that the child is being very shy, because I might go, oh, they're just sitting off to the side. Whereas I need to work out what's actually going on with them and so on. Now, when we're linking our assessment and evaluation, we also have to make sure that we are providing some good context. So we have to think about our objectives. So remember a couple of weeks ago, we spent a lot of time talking about objectives and we looked at it in our tutorials as well. So your objectives must be observable, accessible, and achievable. We have to make sure with our objectives that we identify at the beginning of our processes what we want the children to learn. Then we think about the level of knowledge that we want to see demonstrated. Do we want it down at a straight understanding, or do we want it up at a high order thinking where we want the kids creating and using their information? We have to make sure that we find a verb that matches what we want and the level of knowledge that we want to demonstrate. And remember, that's where we can get those great big sheets from with all of those verbs on them. We then want to think about how do we add in some additional criteria to give it a bit more context in some way. And when we think about our objectives, they should relate to the assessment. So there should be this connection between the objective that we write and the assessment that we create. However, what we don't want to do is just state it as going from the objective to the assessment. So we want to think about how we break it down. So if our objective is by the end of the lesson, students will be able to say the numbers 1 to 5 and identify the numbers 1 to 5 from a selection of numbers. Simple. Our checklist, were the students able to say the numbers 1 to 5? Now, if I was working in a kindergarten, that might even be broken down into, could the children say the numbers 1, 2, and break it down into literally each of the numbers? And could they identify the numbers 1 to 5 from a selection of numbers? So I break it down. I can use a code in my checklist. So some people do a 1, 2, 3. Some people do like 1 dot, 2 dot, 3 dots. Some people do a triangle. So one line means, well, an empty space means they haven't got it. One line means they're beginning to get it. Two, a side and a bottom of the triangle means they've almost got it. A completed triangle means they completely understand that concept. Now, just remember, you often need to break the objective into some smaller parts to make it suitable for the checklist, because otherwise you end up going around in circles where it's too big and you can't identify what they actually know. So you've got this idea that we have to make sure that we create good assessments, that our assessments and our objectives have to provide a nice link to one another. So how does this actually work when you are, first of all, a teacher who is going out on school prac, and second of all, as a real teacher, so to speak? All right, so on your school experiences, you are now going to be asked to do OneNotes for all of your prac, just as our move to making sure that we are in a digital world. Your diagnostic assessment, you'll collect ongoing assessments related to your lessons. Informative, you'll collect data about the student's knowledge before, during, and after teaching your lessons and forward planning documents. In School Experience 3, which is what most of you will do next year, you have to complete your teaching method 2, and that's a precursor to the GTPA. Now, in School Experience 4, which is your internship, you need to complete what's called your GTPA, the Graduate Teaching Professional Assessment. And what that means is that you must demonstrate the Plan, Teach, Assess cycle while you are on prac, and then you write it up as a big assignment once you've finished. So you can go on prac, you can complete all of your requirements for prac, you can complete all your requirements for university, but if you don't complete your GTPA to a level that is sufficient, you will not be graduating. Well, you can graduate from uni, but you won't be able to get a teaching position because you won't complete your TRB. So this is why we want to make sure that you understand the Plan, Teach, Assess cycle. Next year, you'll need to demonstrate it during your school experience, and then in your 4th year, you'll need to demonstrate it for much higher stakes, meaning that it gets marked by external people, and you must demonstrate your Plan, Teach, Assess. So teaching method 2 and the GTPA, this is what you need to do. You need to collect some data about the students. You need to plan using that data. You need to show some differentiation. You need to adjust your planning to suit the individuals and complete some post-programming notes. And then you collect and use that diagnostic, formative and summative assessment. And you need to explain the pedagogical decisions based on your data. So you go through that process for both of those. All right. It's not meant to be stressful. It's just making sure that as a profession that we are meeting professional requirements, just like you would if you're a lawyer, a doctor, and so on. Now, assessment in our classroom. We need to think, what can it look like? So let's look at some of the definitions. So we talk about ongoing assessments. These are teacher devised and developed. And you could have some things like moderation or common tasks, particularly if you're in a school that has more than one of a year level. There's often moderation or common tasks that you create for different things. Your summative assessments, they could be teacher developed. So as a teacher, I develop my little quiz that I want the kids to complete, or I develop my set of questions and so on. They could be school-wide assessments for certain topics, and some schools are starting to introduce those or have had them for a while. You then have some standardized assessments that are external, so things like a NAP plan. You then have standardized assessments that might be school mandated. So as part of what your school does, they might use the PATAR or torch tests and so on, often through the ACER website, and the kids will log in, complete it and do it. There's literally a giant list of them. Different schools use different ones for different reasons. Some schools use them and refer to them and do lots of cool stuff with them. Other schools go through a process of just occasionally using them for certain year levels and so on, because each of them incurs a cost as well. But they're very good for giving you a nice picture of your school data as to what you're doing well and what as a school that you might need to concentrate on. So assessments can be formal or informal. So let's have a look at what formal ones could look like. So when we talk about formal assessments, that could be any of those tests. So any of those standardized tests, there are formal examples. Formal could also be interviews or conferences with individuals or with groups of children. It could also be things like quizzes or tests of some sort. It can be any type of written responses that you want to collect from the kids. It might be that you're getting them to fill in maths journals or science journals or writing journals and so on. It could also include your self-assessments or your peer assessments that the kids are looking at. So you want to think about how are you actually going to create some formal assessments and some informal assessments. So your informal ones are things like your observations of children. So you're sitting there and you might decide that you are going to specifically watch certain children for their gross motor movements. It could be informal where you're just having conversations with a couple of kids about different things, but then you're writing some notes down afterwards and that's what forms your anecdotal notes. It could be getting the kids to do an activity like a think, pair, share. That's an informal. You can see straight away which kids get it and which kids don't, and you can talk to them about it. So when we're thinking about what we do in our early years, some of those you'll be listening to going, yeah, we don't do that. In our early years, our most common forms are our anecdotal notes, all right, and our checklists. Now, when we're doing our anecdotal notes, we have to think, what do they look like? Now, these are some anecdotal notes that I found online. I find anecdotes completely useless if you don't have a purpose to them. So you've got to make sure that you have some reason that you are writing those notes, and it could be a compilation of behaviours over a period of time. I like the way that they have done this, where they do the notes for a particular child. The ones that I find the most useless are the ones where you have one document and you have a box for every child and you write some notes down. Well, why? What are you going to do with those notes? So you need to think, what is the purpose of your anecdotal notes? So keeping regular notes is important, particularly of behaviour. So some kids end up with a gigantic set of notes about their behaviour and other children end up with next to nothing. So you've got to make sure that you are recording those things. I always do lots and lots of notes as well, particularly with my pre-kindies and kindies, about their gross motor development and their fine motor development, because they're things that can be indicators of bigger issues. And things like their speech or their social interactions, they also have some really clear things that you can write down as well. So you've got to make sure that you have a purpose for your anecdotal notes. Writing anecdotal notes about their maths development, that's irrelevant. It's not going to help you. Keeping a checklist, a detailed checklist, that's going to help you for something in their cognitive domain. So anecdotal notes are our one that we use all the time in the early years. The other one that we use all the time is our checklists. So you have to make sure with your checklists that you are linking them to your objectives and that it provides some information about it. But then you've got to make sure that you then use your checklist to do some observations and analysis. So you can go across one child and you can go, oh my goodness, they have some real issues in this area and this area when you look that way. But then you can also go down and say, okay, as a cohort, this is a strength that my class has, but wow, this is a real weakness that we have developed. So that becomes my teaching, that I go back, I reteach, I organize, I make sure that I have allowed enough time for the children to develop and for them to be able to cope with the different tasks in some way. Now, let's think about assessment 1. You are planning for assignment 2, it should be, sorry. You are planning for 3-year-olds. So therefore, you cannot ask the children to read or write. It's not developmentally appropriate. They can't do it. All right. Using worksheets or templates, not appropriate. All right. So you've got to think, how are you going to assess? So writing down in your planning using anecdotal notes, great. Tell me why. What are you actually going to be recording on those anecdotal notes? And with your checklists, the checklist shouldn't just be the objectives reworded. Make sure you break it down into each element. So that forms the assessment columns of your checklist. So it's not about just going checklist on objectives. No, what are you actually looking at in the objectives? All right. Now, for your final assessment, what you need to do, and I've written down the wrong numbers for assessment 1 and 2. So you want to think about when you are doing your last assignment that we have, where we're actually going out to the school, you need to think there's 3 lessons that we are doing at the school. Your lesson 1 is diagnostic. So what do the students already know about the device and the content? So for example, you could do a quick verbal quiz of some sort, bit of a discussion. You might do a simple matching activity with some cards and so on. Your second lesson that you do, what have they learned so far? So you've done a diagnostic, you find out what they know, you might do a quick mental adjustment and you continue on with the lesson in lesson 1. Lesson 2, by the end of it, what have they learned so far? You might do a verbal 2 stars and a wish. You might do a 3, 2, 1 countdown. 3 things I know about this, 2 things I wish I knew, 1 thing that challenged me. There's lots of those that you can do. You might just get each of the children in your group to give you a verbal explanation. You could record that in some way. You could do a little summary of it just on some notes. In your third lesson, it's a summative one. So what did they learn over the 3 lessons? So think you might have something where over the lessons, they actually create a book creator journal. You might take a whole lot of photos that you can then compile in that final lesson, or it might be something you build over the lessons. And then you've got verbal explanations, again, that you can record or you can write some notes over. So if you have a think with your assessments, the assessment you've got coming up for the 3-year-olds, they can't read or write. So you've got to think about how do you write that down for them. However, for your assessment where we are going out to the schools, you're working with pre-primaries, year 1s and year 2s. So some of them will be able to read and write and will be able to do some writing for you in some way. For your assignment that you've got coming up in week 8, they can't read and write. So you've got to think with your assessments. All right, so we're almost at the end. So a lecture summary. You've got to make sure that your assessment matches our SCASA principles. So you've got to make sure that it's fair, it's educative, and so on. You have to plan for your assessment on the school experiences. And that means when you go out on prac next year. You have to include assessment 4 of an as learning when you're thinking about assessment and evaluation. You need to make sure your assessment is developmentally appropriate. So as I said, for our planning that we are doing for 3-year-olds, we don't have a test in there. Don't confuse the assessment with the how or the why. So don't say checklist without telling me how or why you are doing that. And assignments 2 and 3, they have an assessment focus. You must plan for that assessment, particularly when you're going out to the school. All right. So now what I'm going to do is take my thing away and stop sharing. All right, so with our assignments that we've got coming up, with your planning one that is for 3-year-olds? Are we okay thinking about how we're going to do assessments without reading and writing? How does that sound? Okay, you've got to think about without reading and writing for our 3-year-olds. Whereas when we go to the schools, we can do assessments that require a small amount of reading and writing, particularly if you're in your 1s and your 2s. So during the tutorial today, we're having a look a lot more, not today, this week, we're having a look a lot more at assessment. So that gives you some more ideas, hopefully. Plus, we're picking our groups and our tools that we're going to use. All right, we're doing that today and tomorrow. So in each of our groups, we'll be choosing what we're going to do for our work with the students. And then next week, you are on campus and I've got rooms for you, but I've just got to confirm that today. I didn't write it down in my diary as to what rooms you have. So I've got to confirm at uni today, and I'll send an announcement out to everyone that will tell you what your rooms are. And so you'll be at uni next week for your tutorials. So can you please, I'm going to tell my people, I've already told Tracy for my people, I haven't been able to catch Linda to tell her that you might be late. But my Tuesday people, what do you have on? Lots of you have the same thing on before or after Lee's tutorial? What do we have Tuesday people? Somebody put some stuff in the chat. What have we got? Do I need to tell someone that you might be late or you might have to watch a recording or something like that? Nope, you guys are okay? RE before and after remain. Okay. Only have elective. No. Okay. So it's not as bad. Whereas my Monday, you all got dramas on Monday, haven't you? Because you have Tracy straight after this and then the people who come to my tutorial and so on. Yep. All right. So just email me if you're worried about telling someone that you might be late or something like that. We've got rooms booked afterwards and before as well. So that way, if you need to, you can just hang at uni before you head home afterwards. And as you know, there's always people hanging at uni now, isn't there? Where am I? Alana and co that are there sitting in the courtyard at the moment. There's always people there, as with lots of you. All right, any questions? Do you want to drop anything in the chat or anything like that? You guys okay with stuff? All right. I am so happy with this unit. I think, are you finding it useful? Yeah?